$1,800,000. Jock say. That was the number that rang out, clear and sharp, in the dead silence of the courtroom. I felt my heart stop. The only sound left was the rush of blood pounding in my ears. The judge lifted his head from the stack of papers, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on me. His lips didn't move at first, only his hand raised the wooden gavel and brought it down with a solid thud against the bench. The cold glare of fluorescent lights spilled over tense faces. The jury sat upright, their eyes steady, not a flicker of emotion giving anything away. Across the aisle, the defendant's attorney clenched his jaw, fingers gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. One of his associates pressed his lips tightly together, his face drained of color, as if swallowing bad news without a chance to breathe. Judge, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The words struck like another gavel blow, not on the bench, but on the heavy wall inside my chest. My attorney whispering so only I could hear, "We won." I sat frozen, eyes locked on the judge's bench. My throat felt parched. It took me several seconds to force down the breath caught in my chest. Kimmy! So justice does exist? From the gallery behind me came a low ripple of whispers, the sound of shifting wooden seats creaking as people moved. I felt my wife's hand rest on my shoulder light, warm, pulling me back from the haze. But in the same instant, the eyes of the CEO, my former boss, locked onto mine across the distance. Cold, unyielding, and carrying something that wasn't acceptance of defeat. Just for a moment, I knew this wasn't truly over. In my mind, everything unfolded in slow motion, the judge closing the file, the jury rising to leave, the defense attorney packing his papers without a word. That gavel strike still echoed in my head, a sound marking victory, but also the beginning of another storm looming ahead. To reach this moment, I thought, staring at my callous hands, no longer from labor, but from months of wrestling with paperwork, evidence, and sleepless nights, I had to give up far more than you think. My name is Michael Turner, and for nearly 10 years I worked as a safety supervisor at a chemical plant in Texas. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was what kept dozens of people going home in one piece every day. I was known for being meticulous, maybe even a little difficult. Every morning, I'd make my rounds, checking alarm systems and reminding workers to wear their protective gear. Some would joke, "Turner's the safety cop around here," but they'd still smile and comply. One of my proudest moments came a few years ago. A chemical drum began leaking in the warehouse. A few minutes' delay could have cost my coworker his life. I ran in, pulled him out, and got him to safety before the fumes could spread. The next day, at the company-wide meeting, the CEO shook my hand in front of everyone and said, "We need more people like you." Back then, I believed those words were genuine. Life was steady for me at the time. I'd clock out at 4:30 p.m., drag straight to my daughter's elementary school, and pick her up. She has mild asthma, so I was always extra sensitive about environmental safety. Just the thought of a chemical leak near the plant made my chest tighten. The man sitting across from me in the courtroom today is that same CEO. We used to share lunch together, talking about our families and our kids. I remember one afternoon, over burgers in the cafeteria, he looked at me and said, "Family is always the most important thing, right?" I nodded, believing in the sincerity of his eyes. I also had a close colleague, Joe, a man who once owed me his life. On the day of the leak, I was the one who pulled him out while chaos erupted around us. He grabbed my shoulder afterward and choked out, "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be seeing my kids tonight." But when things started to turn ugly, when I was summoned to court, Joe avoided me. In an internal hearing, I heard him say, "I don't really remember. Maybe Turner was just overreacting." The words cut like a knife, not only because they weakened my case, but because they came from someone who once called me a savior. My attorney was sharp, with eyes that could spot a lie before it was spoken. The company's lawyer was the opposite, all smiles when speaking, but with a gaze as sharp as a razor, enough to make you check your wallet after a handshake. The conflict began with a report I submitted. The safety valve on a major storage tank was corroded. If it failed, toxic gas could escape and kill anyone within 30 seconds. No response. I sent a second report, still silence. One morning, while reviewing maintenance records, I found the inspection log for that very tank had pages torn out. The manager glanced at it, handed it back, and said, "Probably just misplaced somewhere." But his eyes slid away from mine. A few weeks later, I overheard the CEO in a closed-door meeting with the head of production. "Don't let these little issues reach upper management. It'll hurt our safety rating." Those little issues were the very hazards I'd reported over and over with no action taken. One afternoon, I went to my direct supervisor's office. "If we don't fix this, someone will get hurt," I said, my voice like stone. He didn't even look up from his papers. "Don't worry. If it hasn't happened yet, it's not a problem." That's when I realized their silence wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate. This wasn't negligence. It was a wall of concealment. At home, I told my wife, "I can't just look the other way." One moment of negligence could cost someone their life. She held my hand, her voice heavy with worry. "But you have to think about our family." "Don't push too hard, we have a child to protect." I felt like I was walking a tightrope torn between the duty to protect everyone at the plant and the responsibility to keep my family safe. And I knew it would only take one hard pull from either side to send me over the edge. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary morning. The compressors hissed steadily, the air thick with the acrid scent of chemicals. A cough echoed from the far end of the hallway, at first sporadic, then rapid, as if someone was choking. When I ran toward the sound, the sight froze my blood. A worker was down on his knees, clutching his chest, his cough breaking into dry retches. His eyes were bloodshot and streaming from the toxic fumes. His trembling hand clutched my arm as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. Another worker shouted in panic, "We should evacuate!" But my direct supervisor strode in, waving his hand dismissively. "No need. Get back to work." The words hit me like an ice-cold slap in the middle of an already suffocating atmosphere. In his eyes, a human life was nothing more than a negligible line item on the production report. Nearby, a drum of chemicals was leaking a yellowish liquid that stung the nose and burned the throat. We rushed the injured man outside and called an ambulance. The diagnosis later confirmed severe chemical inhalation. He would need to be hospitalized for monitoring. I immediately sent out an email alert with photos attached, recommending the entire batch of drums be replaced. Not long after, my desk phone rang. I picked up. On the other end was a low, cold male voice, slow and deliberate, every word like the edge of a blade. "Some things should stay internal, Turner." Then click, the line went dead, leaving only a hollow hum in my ear. That afternoon, after returning from a brief meeting, I found a folded piece of paper in my desk drawer. The handwriting was messy but clear. "Be careful. They're watching you." I glanced around the plant. No one looked at me, but the air suddenly felt heavier. Every step I took felt like it was being measured. Less than an hour later, I was called into the manager's office. The door shut behind me and his voice dropped. "Turner, you need to be careful with what you put in emails. You don't want to make this more complicated." I met his gaze squarely. "If he dies, that email will be the only proof I did my job." Thuck. I thought that would be the end of it, but within days my report vanished into silence. A few weeks later came the second incident. I was inspecting the high-pressure processing area when I heard a strange hiss from the system. I looked at the control panel. The gauge needle was trembling, inching dangerously into the red. Cold sweat trickled down my back as I realized the internal pressure had already exceeded safe limits. A nearby technician lunged for the breaker and cut the power. Just a few seconds later, and the tank might have exploded, engulfing the entire area in flames and toxic gas. I bypassed my immediate supervisors and sent the report straight to corporate. Instead of a serious response, I began hearing snide comments from coworkers loyal to management. "Here goes our hero," saving the world again. Not long after my shift hours were halved, my wife received a letter from our insurance provider. Inside was a cold statement. "Your family's health coverage will terminate if your working hours do not meet the minimum requirement." I held the paper, feeling a tightness in my chest. "You!" Those bold black letters read like a veiled threat. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick away the hours. The next morning, just as I was about to leave for work, my daughter ran up, hugging my leg, and looked up at me. "Daddy, you'll still pick me up every day, right?" I smiled, but my throat tightened. I couldn't lie, but I couldn't tell the truth either. I just patted her head and turned away before she saw my eyes. That night, when I told my wife what had happened, she sat in silence for a long moment before asking, "If they fire you, what will we do?" I glanced at our daughter sleeping in the next room and answered, steady and certain. "I'd rather lose my job than have someone lose their life." Fur! The following day, I was summoned to the HR director's office. No warning, no lengthy explanation, just a single sheet of paper, termination of employment. As I walked out of the building, the paper in my hand felt like a verdict. The Texas sun still blazed overhead, but I felt as though I was standing in a dense, dark cloud. In my head, one thought echoed, "They think they can crush me. They're wrong." I knew this wasn't just about losing my job. Someone was trying to silence me, and if I stayed silent, others would face far worse than I had seen. The first day I met my attorney, we sat in a small office lined with shelves of case files and framed photos of past clients who had won. She looked at me over thin metal frames, her voice calm but razor sharp. "Our strategy is to prove the company knowingly violated federal workplace safety laws. That's the only way to strike directly at their legal liability." She spread a stack of documents across the desk, marking the points that could become evidence. I studied each page, feeling like I was holding pieces of a giant puzzle I couldn't yet see in full. But within 2 weeks, obstacles began to pile up. A key witness. the one who had confirmed seeing the safety valve. Damaged suddenly changed his story. He told my attorney he didn't clearly remember and wasn't sure it was that serious. I knew it wasn't memory loss. It was fear of retaliation. At the same time, a technical report we had planned to use. The original documenting the deterioration of the system suddenly disappeared from the archives. The records clerk just shook his head. "I've never seen that document." While combing through my own files, I noticed something else. Several emails directly tied to the case had vanished from my personal inbox. No deletion notices, nothing in the trash, like someone had quietly entered my account and scrubbed it clean. Before I could try to recover them, my attorney called. Her voice was tense. "I just got an anonymous phone call. They said, 'Don't let this go to court.'" She paused for a few seconds, then added, "They're trying to scare us!" Which tells me, we've hit a nerve. The legal hurdles were bad enough, but the pressure inside my own family was growing heavier. One evening, I came home to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, turning a teacup in her hands. "Son, let it go. Fighting them will only hurt you." I gripped my hands together, meeting her eyes. "Mom, if that had been someone else's child that day..." "Could you stay quiet?" She stayed silent. Late one night, while I was reviewing files, the phone rang. My younger brother's voice was low and tense. "You're dragging the whole family into danger." "You know who they are. Stop before it's too late." I stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering. If everyone stays silent, this will never stop. Days later, my mother sat across from me at the dining table, starting to speak, but stopping halfway. She lowered her eyes, tears glistening. I took her hand and said softly, "I'm going to keep going." She didn't reply, only nodded faintly, but I could feel her fear. "Ooh!" At least my wife was still by my side, even through her worry. She didn't say much, but every night she brewed coffee for me as I worked late over stacks of documents. I knew exactly what that meant. It was her way of standing with me, even if she was just as afraid. Then, one evening, as I was reading through depositions, my attorney called, her voice electric with excitement. "We just got what you need." She told me a thick envelope had arrived at her office with no return address. On the front, in rough handwriting, were the words, "They can't hide forever." Inside was a printed internal report, the very document the company had buried for months. In it, the CEO himself had signed off on rejecting the safety valve repair request, stating, "The cost is too high for the benefit." In another twist, she had also found the same file while combing through an old hard drive the company thought they had discarded. Die! The drive contained internal email chains exposing the deliberate cover-up. When I held the papers in my hands, it felt like gripping the sharpest blade I could take into that courtroom. This time I wouldn't miss, but the clock was nearly out. The trial was in exactly 5 days. My attorney set the stack of documents on the table, her voice grave. "If we can't get this authenticated in time, the court won't accept it." I stared at the papers like they were a ticking bomb. Each passing hour was another click of the countdown clock, pushing us closer to the edge between a crushing victory and a devastating loss. When my attorney finally closed the file, I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The trial was closing in, but this time we had something they couldn't deny. I knew I had the knife in my hand, and now it was time to turn it toward the one who deserved it. That morning, the moment I stepped into the courtroom, I could feel the weight pressing down on my shoulders. Harsh white lights spilled from above, highlighting every crack in the ceiling. The faint scent of old wood from the long benches mixed with the sharp, clean smell of freshly printed case files stacked high on the tables. The clerk's pen tapped rhythmically against the desk, punctuated by the rustle of paper. I took a deep breath, forcing my heartbeat into a steady rhythm as I looked around. The jury sat in stern silence. The judge leafed through pages of testimony, and the attorneys on both sides prepared as if for a duel to the death. When proceedings began, the opposing counsel wasted no time. He stood, walking deliberately toward the witness stand, his voice smooth and cold. "Mr. Turner, did you send these reports with the intent to damage the company's reputation?" I met his gaze. "No. I sent them to prevent an accident that could cost human lives." He arched a brow, glancing at the jury. "But you can't deny you bypassed your direct supervisors, correct?" I kept my tone steady. "Correct, because I knew if I went through them, the report would never reach those with the authority to act." He pressed his lips together, clearly irritated that I hadn't walked into his trap. Then he threw out another question, aiming to shift the ground beneath me. "Do you have any proof the company intentionally concealed violations?" I glanced at my attorney. She gave the slightest nod. She rose and stepped toward the evidence table. "Your Honor, we would like to call our next witness." The courtroom door opened. A tall, lean man in a gray suit stepped in. I recognized him instantly, the plant's chief engineer who had mysteriously vanished from the witness list months earlier. As the secret witness entered, several jurors instinctively leaned forward, as if they didn't want to miss a single word. The overhead lights caught the sheen of sweat on the CEO's forehead. The collar of his shirt was slightly rumpled, a small, human crack in his polished facade. Every time opposing counsel leapt to object, the screech of chairs dragging across the wooden floor sliced through the already suffocating tension. The engineer walked straight to the stand, his gaze calm but resolute. My attorney asked, "Do you recognize this document?" The engineer nodded. "Yes. This is the original technical report we submitted to management, warning that the safety valve was severely degraded and needed immediate replacement." As he testified, my attorney calmly laid out a stack of printed internal emails. Each page landed on the defense table with a sharp thwack, like hammer blows driving nails into the defendant's composure. The CEO twisted a gold ring on his finger, slowly at first, then faster, clumsier, as if one more question would shatter the calm mask he was struggling to maintain. The opposing counsel stiffened, then stood to object. "Your Honor, this document was declared non-existent in the official record." The judge's eyes locked on the CEO, his voice even, butt-cutting. "Were you aware that concealing this violates federal law?" My attorney turned to the jury, then slowly held up a small USB drive. "Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence to present." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. A faint static hum preceded a voice, familiar, unmistakable. "We cannot let this report get out." It was the CEO. The room fell dead silent. A few jurors leaned forward, eyes wide. In the gallery, my wife gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles went white. As for me, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding like the sound of a judge's gavel. The defendant swallowed hard, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Fuck. I choose to remain silent." That silence was louder than any confession. The jurors exchanged glances, some shook their heads faintly. The air in the room had shifted, tilted decisively in my favor. My attorney pressed on, questioning the witness about the internal emails he had preserved, proving the company had deliberately ignored the repair request because the cost was deemed too high for the benefit. Each answer was another nail in the coffin of the defense's case. I sat still, my palms cold but my eyes fixed on the witness stand. This was the moment I had waited for through all those months, the second when the truth could no longer be buried. When the examination ended, the judge called for a recess so the jury could deliberate. The gavel struck the desk, its echo rolling through the courtroom. This time, it no longer felt distant. It sounded like my own heartbeat, fast, full, and ready to meet the verdict head-on. That afternoon, the courtroom was silent as the jury room door swung open. Everyone stood, eyes fixed on each measured step they took. I tried to read the expressions on their faces, but each one remained stern, giving nothing away. My heart pounded, sweat gathering in my palms. The judge took the paper from the foreman, his eyes scanning it quickly before reading aloud. "Damages awarded to the plaintiff, $1,800,000. In that moment, every sound around me seemed to vanish. My legs felt weightless, as if the massive stone that had pressed on me for months had finally been lifted. I gripped my wife's hand. Her palm was trembling but warm. She pressed her lips together, tears rolling down her cheeks even as she forced a smile. Across the aisle, the CEO sat motionless, his head bowed as though the weight of the entire room rested on his shoulders. His frame sagged, a faint tremor in his shoulders, his lips moving as if to speak, only to swallow the words back down. Their attorney kept his head low, shoving files into his briefcase with uncharacteristic haste. There was no attempt to speak, no glance toward the jury or toward me. As they left the table, he leaned slightly toward his client, whispering something so low it was drowned out by the growing murmur in the courtroom. The press swarmed the moment I stepped out of the courtroom, microphones, cameras, and a barrage of questions. "Mr. Turner, what's your reaction to this verdict? Do you have a message for your former company?" I answered simply. "Justice needs to be seen and carried out." The next day, the case made front-page headlines across multiple major newspapers. Company XYZ ordered to pay $1.8 million for workplace safety violations. Television news dissected every detail of the trial, from the internal documents to the damning audio recording. On social media, my story spread as an example of how one person could shake an entire system. Within days, a major contractor announced it was canceling a multi-million-dollar deal with XYZ, citing concerns over safety standards and corporate integrity. Pressure from shareholders and public outrage surged. Soon after, the CEO issued a short internal email announcing his resignation for personal reasons and his decision to take time to focus on family. No one believed the explanation. That evening, while I was clearing the dinner table, my phone rang. A familiar voice came from an old factory line. "You did what we couldn't. Thank you." I recognized it immediately, a former co-worker who had once quietly slipped a warning note into my desk drawer months before. A few days later, my daughter ran to hug me as soon as I walked through the door. "Daddy, did you win?" I nodded and held her close, but deep down, I knew this story wasn't truly over. A week later, as I was making coffee in the morning, my phone buzzed with an email from my lawyer. The subject line was just 2 words: appeal filed. The message read simply, "They're preparing to appeal with new evidence." I opened the attachment. The moment I saw it, I knew exactly where it had come from and who had sent it. Part of me felt an icy chill run through my spine. The other part was already bracing for the next fight. This battle had only just begun. The trial was over, but its echoes followed me with every step I took. The sound of the gavel, the jurors' stares, and the moment the CEO bowed his head were etched into my memory. People say that winning a lawsuit brings relief, but I realized that feeling isn't as pure as I had imagined. Behind the victory lay a trail of losses, scars, and unanswered questions. I thought about the workers who once coughed and gasped in the factory, about the nights my daughter struggled to breathe when the air turned cold. Well, those images had driven me forward, even when I knew the cost to myself and my family would be high. If I had stayed silent, maybe life would have been easier for us, but how many more people would have paid the price? I learned one thing: justice doesn't simply arrive at your door. It comes only when you have the courage to stand up. And sometimes, standing up isn't about winning for yourself, it's about setting a precedent so others know they, too, have the right to speak. Throughout the case, I saw every kind of human reaction, support, betrayal, and fearful silence. Yet it was those few words of encouragement, those rare, shared glances of solidarity, that kept me from giving up. I also came to understand another truth: a legal victory doesn't mean the fight is over. The company still exists, and the people behind those reckless decisions are still out there. They will find ways to protect their interests, even if it means twisting the truth. And I, once I stepped into this fight, had no way back. That day, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The afternoon sunlight fell in pale gold, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a rare sense of peace. But then I remembered the appeal email from the week before. Deep down, I knew this was just a brief calm before another storm. When I returned home, I opened the mailbox. Amid the bills and scattered flyers, there was a gray envelope with no sender listed. The handwriting was rough, my name scrawled across the front. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling my heartbeat pound. I let out a small, tired but determined smile. I thought it was all over until another letter appeared in my mailbox. They're like, "Chu is cruel and dead, my if phrase God we really."